Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the Old Ottawa South Garden Club. Our speaker tonight is Rebecca Last, who will be talking to us about plant guilds. Carol, please introduce our speaker.
Our speaker tonight is Rebecca Last. Rebecca has been gardening on and off since age 8 and has been a member of the Master Gardeners of Ottawa Carleton since 2005. Her small suburban garden is certified by the Canadian Wildlife Federation as a wildlife habitat. Rebecca's garden design includes elements of permaculture. In 2018, Rebecca received an Ontario Volunteer Service Award in recognition of her 10 years of service with the Master Gardeners of Ottawa Carleton. This presentation will encourage listeners to think in terms of modifying their conventional gardening strategies to begin creating a self-sustaining ecosystem that will become more productive and result in less work over time. She will explore examples of plant guilds, connection, natural patterns, and zones that will help gardeners put together the pieces of that self-sustaining ecosystem. Please join me in welcoming Master Gardener Rebecca Last for her presentation, Plant Guilds, Taking Companion Planting to the Next Level. Rebecca.
Thank you so much, Carol. And I'm just going to share my screen now. And tonight we are going to be talking about plant guilds. Now, this is both a very old idea and also a relatively new concept. When Europeans first arrived on the shores of what we now call the eastern seaboard of North America, many of them commented on how the landscape looked very open and park-like. And that's because a number of the Indigenous people in the area had been practicing a kind of sustainable forest food gardening through selective planting, harvesting, and clearing by burning. Unfortunately, our settler ancestors didn't take any time to study these gardens. And so today we're trying to relearn which plants grow together harmoniously. It's still very much an evolving field of study. And one way to think about plant guilds is that a single plant guild is essentially one building block in a forest food garden. I'd like to add a couple of cautionary notes here. The first is that the concept of permaculture is very much oriented around useful plants and particularly edible plants. So before you start munching down on something that is not what you would normally consider an edible plant, you should do your own research and be cautious about the potential for having an allergic reaction. Secondly, we'll be talking a little bit about medicinal plants, and you should really never try your own homemade herbal remedies without first seeking professional advice. We tend to think of herbal remedies as being entirely innocuous, and in fact, that's not the case. Without knowing what you're doing, they can actually be quite dangerous. So today, what we're going to be talking about is a little bit on definitions. We'll talk about the difference between plant guilds versus companion planting. We'll talk about how we tend to baby our gardens and really try to maintain them in a kind of status quo, which is not at all natural. So we'll talk about how we think about our gardens in terms of maturing ecosystems instead of just babying them. I'll give you some examples of two very multi-talented plants, and then we'll talk more generally about the plant functions in our garden ecosystem. I'll give you some examples of plant guilds, and then we'll talk about how we can put the pieces together. And by the way, that cover illustration that you saw comes from a website called Terra Visis, which is one of many websites devoted to permaculture. So companion planting is a concept many of you will be familiar with from organic gardening. The concept of companion planting is essentially that you're trying to prevent something negative from happening by planting different crops together so that you can encourage pest control, promote pollination, provide habitat for beneficial creatures, maximize the amount of space, and otherwise increase your crop productivity. Plant Guilds, however, expands that concept by incorporating not only plants, but also animals, insects, and other natural components that each work together to help ensure each other's survival, and with each element of the plant guild working to support all the other elements that are growing nearby. Wikipedia defines plant guilds as any group of species that exploit the same resources, often in related ways, and defines the plant guild according to the locations, attributes, and the activities of the component species. So when we talk about activities of component species, we're really talking about that concept of ecosystem functions that we'll get into in a few more slides. So permaculture, interestingly enough, is one of those made-up words that originated in Australia with David Holmgren, who was a graduate student in the 1970s, and his professor, Bill Mollison. Holmgren and Mollison looked around at what was happening with annual planting of annual crops in Australia's drylands, and realized the kind of ecological damage that this annual tillage and planting and harvesting was doing to those drylands. And they compared that to the sorts of very abundant forest food gardens that they found in nearby Pacific Islands, where the climate was quite similar. The big difference was that the forest food gardens on the Pacific Islands were using primarily perennial plants for their food sources. And so taking this as inspiration, Holmgren and Mollison came up with the term permaculture, a made-up word that combines permanent, or the idea of perennial plants, with agriculture. And more recently, the term has been taken to mean not only agriculture, but also culture. And we see in the three main ethics of permaculture that the first one is caring for people in a sustainable fashion. The second ethic is earth care, taking care of the planet. And the third is the concept of fair share, returning or sharing the surplus. And of course, when we grow with permanent or perennial plants, we often find that our crop increases in abundance year over year, which is not generally something you find with annual agriculture. So let's talk a little bit more about the differences between companion planting and plant guilds. So with companion planting, we're typically talking about annual plants, and we might have 2 or 3 plants. So generally speaking, companion planting systems are relatively simple and relatively short-lived. And in plant guilds, as we'll see, the key components of the plant guild are not only perennial plants, they're woody plants that are going to persist for many years, for decades, perhaps even hundreds of years, and that we're using many more than 2 or 3 plants. So there's a lot more complexity involved and a lot more thought that has to go into a plant guild. The philosophical context, as I mentioned, companion planting grows out of the organic growing movement, and plant guilds are something deriving from permaculture. In terms of aesthetics, our companion planting is often fairly neat and constrained. And in comparison, plant guilds can look a little bit messy or even chaotic. With companion plantings, the idea, as we said, is to minimize harm, avoid competition, and create a positive environment. With plant guilds, however, our concept is really to minimize the amount of inputs and throughputs, which essentially means waste, to create an abundant closed loop system that's going to become self-sustaining as an ecosystem. And that closed loop concept is really key to understanding what we're trying to accomplish. When I say throughput, I mean essentially waste. So again, if you're one of those people that goes out and buys bags of soil every year for your garden and lots of mulch and things like that, switching to a plant guilds approach might actually save you money as well as labor year over year. One of the most fascinating things I find about plant guilds in comparison to companion planting is this productivity. ROI means return on investment. Now, when we talk about organic agriculture, I'm thinking about the fact that I've got lights in the basement, and in a few more weeks, I'll be starting my tomato seedlings. I do have purchased sterile potting mix to plant into. I'm going to be running those lights. I'm going to be irrigating my new little seedlings. And in a few more weeks, hopefully, I'll be transplanting them outside. I'll be moving them outside to harden them off and then transplanting them. All of that effort and time goes into an annual crop. So all in all, my productivity is probably about 1-to-1, 1 unit of my energy in to produce 1 unit of energy out. Now, that's certainly much better than you find in conventional agriculture, the kinds of agriculture we see when we drive through the green belt or through the countryside, where we find field upon field of maize or canola, or what's the other one that's really popular, the soy products and so forth. All of these things are grown with a lot of inputs. The farmers are typically buying proprietary seed. They can't save their own seed. They have to buy new seed every year. They're buying fertilizer. They're buying fuel for the tractor. They're harvesting, they're tilling, all of the energy that goes into that. And the average on estimate of this productivity, which is clearly not sustainable, is that with conventional agriculture, 1 unit of energy in produces about 1/10 of a unit of energy out. And in both organic and conventional systems, our productivity tends to decline over time. Now, I want you to contrast that with thinking about planting, let's say, a little apple tree. Now, first year, we may not get any apples. We may not get any apples until the second or third year. But fast forward maybe 5 to 10 years, that little apple tree has gotten bigger and it's producing more apples than we can use. We're giving away apples to the neighbors. We're making applesauce. We're making apple cider. The raccoons are coming and getting drunken on the fallen apples. So our productivity increases over time with that perennial system of planting. And the estimates are that in a plant guild that's functioning, you should have about 1 unit of energy in to 50 units of energy out. So vastly more productive than either the organic or the conventional system. Companion planting's environmental impact is to be minimally negative. We want to do as little harm as possible, but we're still requiring some inputs and we're creating some waste. However, with plant guilds, what we aim for is a positive ecosystem that contributes services including wildlife habitat, carbon sequestration, food, fuel, materials for crafting, and so on and so forth. So we're really aiming to make a very positive contribution to the environment, and that's another important difference. I'm going to show you some pictures of vacant lots. And this is one that's perhaps a year or two old. You can see that it used to be a parking lot. There's weeds cropping up through the asphalt. Fast forward a few more years, this is a different lot, but you can see that we've got more plants. And in a few more years, we're actually seeing some woody plants that have started to establish themselves in this barren ground. And the purpose of these illustrations is to show you that nature doesn't sit still. When we're gardening, we do have a tendency to want nature to sit still. We want to cut the lawn so that it's never more than 2 or 3 inches long. We want to prune our trees and our shrubs so that they stay more or less the same size and they don't outgrow their space. We're dividing up our clumps of perennials so that they don't get too big for their britches. But the reality is that plants grow and they get bigger. And if we allow the ecosystem in our garden to mature, and we plan for that maturation, we're going to be allowing our gardens to really fulfill their function as a little mini ecosystem. And that's one of the key things I want you to take away from tonight's lecture. So let's talk about some of the ecosystems that you can get. And we'll begin with one very multi-talented plant. This illustration comes from Texas A&M Forest Service, but of course the white oak, Quercus alba, is native to this part of the world as well. And if this were a live lecture, I'd be asking you to tell me what kinds of ecosystems or eco-services you think that this live oak will produce for us. And I'm sure most of you would start by saying, well, there's shade. It's producing habitat for birds and squirrels, even though we may not want squirrels. There's a lot of different services that this one tree will provide. For example, the different temperatures at different altitudes within that tree structure create cooling breezes. There's water cycling. A mature oak will transpire up to 2,000 gallons of water on a hot day. And in doing so, the dust and pollen and other particles rising from the leaves will actually seed clouds. Some of you, I'm sure, have been following the rapid destruction of the Amazon forest. And one of the things that's particularly worrying about this is that as we fell trees in the Amazon forest, we are destroying the ability of that part of the world to generate rain clouds and moisture, which will make it very difficult to regenerate at whatever point we decide to start replanting. The shade provided by the tree will help to cool your home. It also retains water in the soil, and the roots of the tree retain water and will stabilize the soil. Those roots also attract and sustain beneficial soil organisms, such as mycorrhizae. There's certain species of mushrooms, for example, that are closely associated with oaks. Mushrooms being the fruiting body of mycorrhizae. We have carbon and oxygen cycling that are built into, sort of hardwired into our oak tree. It's an air purifier. Mature oaks have about 10 to 30 acres of leaf surface that traps dust and other airborne particles. And of course, by constantly shedding bits of pollen and dust and mold spores and manure from perching birds and squirrels, small branches and leaves, our oak tree is busy enriching the soil around it. And the acorns are a traditional food not only for squirrels, but also for First Nations people. So we're getting a lot of value out of our one oak tree. Now, mind you, an oak tree is a pretty big plant. We should expect a big plant like this to do a lot for the environment. So let's turn our attention to a slightly more modest herbaceous perennial, the humble comfrey plant, Symphytum officinale. This is in the Boraginaceae plant family, rather. It's a plant that's been used medicinally for centuries. And in fact, illustrations of it appear as early as the early 17th century in Basil Bessler's Hortus Eastentensis, which is the earliest large folio of botanical information. It's traditionally known as knit bone because it was thought to speed healing. And in fact, comfrey leaves do contain the chemical allantoin, which is proven as an anti-inflammatory. And it's commonly used in cosmetics, especially skin creams, and has been named in over 10,000 patents, most of which are medicinal or cosmetic in nature. Those small flowers, they're shown as white here. Often they're a mauvey blue flower. They attract bees and other pollinators. Those big fuzzy leaves make an excellent mulch material. In fact, if you're camping and forgot to bring the toilet paper with you, they can be useful for that as well. And look at those big roots. My goodness, those things are massive. So they delve deep into the soil, they break up the hard pan and allow the plant to access nutrients from the subsoil and mineral layer below it. This is nutrients such as potassium, calcium, magnesium, all of which are essential nutrients for plant growth and development. The leaves have even been used as cattle fodder because they're about 35% protein. Apparently cows don't like them very much, but they'll eat them if there's nothing else around. A couple of cautionary notes about comfrey. It's not really encouraged for internal use because the plant also contains some toxic alkaloids, and it should not be used either internally or externally by pregnant women. Timing of the harvest is important because those harmful alkaloids that I mentioned are greatest in the early spring, and they tend to concentrate in the roots. And speaking of those roots, if you have a small garden, comfrey is probably not a good plant for you because those roots can spread. Even one tiny little section will create a whole new plant. And you'll find yourself with a plant that's very difficult to remove if you decide you don't want it anymore. Thoughts on making comfrey tea is a question that I see here. Well, as we saw, there's certainly a lot of trace minerals that would not be dissolved in water. And so that would be part of the value of having comfrey tea added to your garden, not for consumption by humans, that is, but making comfrey tea and spreading it on your garden is a good source of small quantities of these micronutrients that are useful to the plant, to plants in our garden. So yeah, nothing wrong with doing that. So we're going to turn our attention now to a suite of ecosystems that we want to have, eco-services that we want to have in our garden ecosystem. And the first plant function that we're looking for is the mulch makers. Now, these are typically plants that are fast growing, perhaps a little messy because they drop litter. They may have abundant soft leaves, decompose rapidly, and hopefully they serve some other purposes. Now, we want to note here that if we're talking about plants that make mulch, we will avoid the plants that are allelopathic, so particularly members of the Euglens family, walnuts, butternuts. There's another one that I'm blanking on right now, and of course sunflowers, which are also allelopathic. So these are not plants that make good mulch. And if you might even want to be careful about adding these to your compost pile because they could impede germination or growth in other plants if they're not properly decomposed. So we saw comfrey as a good example of mulch maker. Beans and nasturtiums, two annual plants, are also excellent mulch makers. Beans, of course, have at least one other function, as do nasturtiums, and we'll talk about that later. In my front yard, I have a rather unsightly feature. It's the support wire for a telephone pole. And shortly after moving to this house, my neighbor and I colluded and planted Virginia creeper to hide both the telephone pole and this support wire. But it's a messy plant, Virginia creeper. I was out kind of guttling around in the flower bed underneath where the creeper grows, and it was late spring, I guess. The plant had already had its flowering, and bits of it kept dropping on my head, and I was really quite annoyed with it. And then I stopped myself and I realized, all those little bits of messy Virginia creeper were doing the job of mulching this flower bed for me without me having to lift a finger. So it was a good kind of personal aha moment in terms of recognizing the gifts that we can get from nature that we can take for granted if we're not gardening in a mindful way. Other examples of mulch makers are leafy weeds like burdock, plantain, red clover, mallow, and even aquatic plants. I have a very small pond, and I typically like to use duckweed as a cover to provide some shade for my goldfish. But by about the middle to the end of July, that duckweed has gotten so thick that I have to start pulling it out by the handful. And what I've discovered is that it's a wonderful mulch to add just green around the plants in my garden that are particularly thirsty at that time of year, when we often also have a bit of a drought. Another kind of ecosystem function that we're looking from plants in our garden is nutrient accumulation. Now, often this comes from those pioneer species that we might think of as being weeds. And that's because these are species that often have deep tap roots or very diffuse fibrous roots that are efficient at drawing nutrients up from the soil. So yarrow, chamomile, fennel, lamb's quarters, Chenopodium album, which many of us think of as a weed, but is in fact quite a nutritious edible spring green, chicory, dandelion, of course, and plantain, which I learned recently indigenous people called white men's footsteps, because plantain was a plant that followed the colonials as they settled across North America. And that's because it's not only an effective nutrient accumulator, but it is also an edible plant. It's one of those ones you probably don't want to eat unless you're really hungry, but it is edible. Then we have our nitrogen fixers. And of course, all of us are familiar with the beans, peas, clover, and even perhaps with plants like false indigo, Baptisia australis, which is a herbaceous perennial that fixes nutrients, fixes nitrogen rather. And all of these plants form a symbiotic relationship with nitrogen. And it's actually the bacteria in this symbiotic relationship that fix the nitrogen. And if you've ever pulled up a bit of clover from your lawn and you look at it very closely, or you pull up your beans by the roots at the end of the season and look closely at those roots, you might see that little crystals of nodules of nitrogen, which is normally a gas, that have been fixed by those symbiotic bacteria. Now, it wasn't until I started researching this presentation that I learned that there are also a number of woody trees that are nitrogen fixers. So the Gleditsia or locust tree family, Siberian pea shrub, Carragina aberensis, and the Russian olive. Now, unfortunately, the Siberian pea shrub, Carragina, and Russian olive are species that are now classified as somewhat invasive in our part of the world. And the Plant This Instead folks at the Ontario Invasive Plant Council will suggest alternatives. So perhaps locust or Gleditsia is our best choice if we're looking for a nitrogen fixing woody plant. Well, here we have another function for nasturtiums. It turns out that nasturtiums are a very effective pest repellent plant because they're quite effective at repelling whitefly. That false indigo that we talked about as a nitrogen fixer is another example of a plant that secretes substances that discourage infestation. Now note, this is not an especially well-researched area. In fact, Diana Beresford Kroger has said that you only need to plant marigolds once every 3 years, and the exudate from marigold roots will keep your soil free of those harmful herbaceous nematodes that can get into your root crops and make a mess of them. I've actually planted nasturtiums and marigolds annually in the same place year after year, and I haven't really noticed any significant problems with that. But I will say, as we get on in the presentation, that sunflowers, which are an allelopathic plant, one that practices chemical warfare on its neighbors, that's one that I've tried planting 2 or 3 years in a row, and that's not a good idea because they will actually poison the soil and prevent the germination of the next generation of sunflowers the year afterwards. A little bit about insectaries. Now, these are very popular plants as we work to maintain and preserve what's left of our natural heritage of bees and other pollinating insects. So the characteristics of an insectary plant: fragrant flowers, which is something many of us want to have in our garden anyway, blooms that are rich in pollen or nectar, night blooming species and night scented species of plants, like, for example, the used to be called Cimicifuga, now Actea, a black cohosh or snakeroot native plant, beautiful native plant, and it's night scented, which is great for late season pollinators that are insects like moths, for example, that are active at night. And of course, we want to maintain blooms throughout the season. Again, something that we gardeners want anyway, but our pollinator visitors want this as well. Now, I want to note here that there are two main kinds of beneficial insects. There's our pollinators that we're all aware of course, but we also want to encourage the beneficial predators, such as the parasitic wasps, which can be so helpful as pest control in our gardens. So some examples here, we have yarrow, which you'll recall was also a good pioneer species and a nutrient accumulator. Buckwheat, another good nutrient accumulator. Lamiaceae family, there's about 200 species of mostly edible herbs in the Lamiaceae family, although it also includes coleus, which is not so edible. And you'll see that that family mentioned again when we talk about food plants. Clovers, great for pollinators, and also, as we saw, good nutrient fixers. So what you should be getting from this is that as we're creating our garden ecosystem, we're looking for not just one function from plants, but especially in our small urban gardens, we're looking for plants that will fulfill a number of ecosystem functions. The Liliaceae family, perhaps not the most useful in the garden, but my goodness, they really are gorgeous. I can't resist a good oriental lily. And the Asteraceae family, which is humongous. I think that is, in fact, the largest plant family. And of course, we all know that the Asteraceae is not, one daisy or one sunflower is not a single flower, but is in fact many, many flowers squinched together, providing lots of food for pollinators. And then when it comes to attracting those beneficial parasitical wasps, members of the carrot family are really our best friend. One of the plants I grow in my front yard is a rather majestic stand of lovage, which is an old-fashioned perennial herb. And when it goes into flower, it is covered with these kind of scary looking great big black mud dauber wasps, but they're super duper beneficial parasitic insects that are very helpful in keeping down the pests that I might otherwise find in my garden. And even weeds like Queen Anne's lace, for example, is great for that purpose. Allelopathic, it starts with the A, but I think other than that, you've got it right. Nicole was asking how you spell the word allelopathic. Moving on to barrier plants. Now, if you've ever had to block out an unsightly view, or maybe wanted to create a little bit of privacy, these barrier plants are the ones that you want to be looking at. You can create a living wall. You can block more aggressive plants. So for example, I've found that violets, if anybody's ever had to deal with goutweed in their garden, believe it or not, the plain ordinary violets, which by the way are also a useful host plant for a number of our native pollinators and butterflies, violets will outcompete goutweed, believe it or not. Jerusalem artichoke. Now this one can be a bit of a thug. It looks a bit like a kind of anemic sunflower with a small flower head, but it produces a rather delicious edible root. At one point in the early 19th century, Canadian farmers were encouraged to plant Jerusalem artichokes by some well-meaning government agency. And they certainly do grow easily in very poor quality soil. However, they're thugs. So I wouldn't recommend Jerusalem artichoke for a small garden. Sunflowers, as we mentioned, have that allelopathic property. They are specifically anti-germination allelopathy. So you can actually plant seedlings around a sunflower, and generally speaking, they'll do quite well. I wouldn't recommend putting sunflowers next to your tomatoes. They don't like each other very much. Big root geranium, the Geranium macrorhizae, macrorhiza is another one that is an excellent barrier plant. It also has deliciously fragrant leaves and is a very effective plant if you've had problems with dogs or cats getting into your flower beds. Use the big root geranium as a border plant, and it will tend to discourage pets from crossing it. For an example of windbreaks, I love the concept of a fedge, which is a sort of combination of fruit or food hedges, a hedge made up of edible plants such as cedar, hazelnut, Nanking cherry, lilacs, witch hazel, all kinds of wonderful things that you can plant. Hazelnuts, you need 2 of them, by the way. As you do with Nanking cherries, you need at least 2 for good pollination and good crops. And then with hazelnuts, the other thing you need is a BB gun to keep the squirrels at bay. But that's another story. I've tried everything. I've yet to harvest more than one hazelnut from my entire 2 hazelnut bushes. You can make living walls also. I had a friend with a condominium not too far from Ottawa University. And at one point he was responsible for the condo grounds. And one of the biggest problem they had was university students cutting across the property. I suggested he plant devil's walking stick, Aralia spinosa, which is a pretty scary looking plant. I don't think he did, and it's probably a good thing because I can just imagine the lawsuits. Thistles also, the Eryngium plant family, sea hollies, and tall ornamental grasses and dense vines like my beloved and much reviled Virginia creeper are also things that make good living walls. Now, what about plants that nurture wildlife? Well, my hazelnut certainly does that. But really, when we talk about wildlife nurturing, we don't want plants that just offer food. We want plants that offer shelter, nesting materials, and nesting sites. And in fact, the backyard habitat requirements from the Canadian Wildlife Federation will give you some excellent suggestions of plants that provide all of these qualities. In fact, one of my other talks, which was inspired by a challenge from your garden club, talks in detail about how to create food, shelter, and other things that wildlife need so that you can have your garden qualify for that backyard habitat certification. Nectar plants, obviously, for pollinators, fruit, nut, and seed-bearing natives. Native plants in general are preferred by wildlife because that's what they grew up with. That's what they evolved with. When we're talking about evergreens, we really want the dense evergreens, the ones that are thorny. Grasses can provide excellent habitat for many types of critters. And generally messiness, wood piles, ground litter, hollow trees, and nurse logs are things that wildlife will all appreciate. Now, what about plants for human use? I mean, it is our garden. We're the ones paying the property taxes, so we should enjoy it as well. And of course, we're looking for plants that have food value, perhaps, ornamental value, certainly. Maybe plants that have some craft value, or perhaps that we could use for fuel or for medicinal use. keeping in mind what I said at the outset about being very careful how you use medicinal plants in your garden, making sure you know what you're doing and you've sought out your physician's advice first. So lots of examples of food plants, not only the annuals that we're familiar with, but many perennials as well, including some herbaceous perennials and woody plants. I mentioned my two hazelnut shrubs. I've also got red currant bush. I've got grapevines, and I've got a Nanking cherry, a serviceberry. These are all woody plants that produce food for me. In terms of herbaceous perennials that you may not think of, hostas. If you blanch the leaves, and by that I mean deprive them of sunlight, you know, the stage of hosta growth when they first come out of the ground and they look like big fat pencil tips. At that point, if you put a bucket or a flower pot over your up to 1/3 of your hosta, you are blanching the leaves by depriving them of sunlight, and it produces a very pale sprout that tastes a lot like Boston lettuce. It's quite delicious. Tradescantia shoots are another thing that's really tasty. And if you're wrestling with Japanese knotweed on your property, you should know that those very early shoots, as they first emerge out of the ground, are actually quite delicious. They've got a very strong citrusy flavor, and you can steam them extremely lightly, like 10 to 20 seconds most in the microwave, to produce a really delicious edible. So that's one way of controlling those rambunctious Japanese knotweed plants. Do be careful about your medicinal uses. I have a witch hazel plant in my front yard. I use the bark and branch clippings from late winter and boil those up to make a medicinal decoction of witch hazel, but it's only applied externally. And it needs to be fixed with about 25% alcohol, otherwise it goes bad quickly. I also use the witch hazel flowers and soak them in alcohol in the late fall. After about 6 or 8 weeks, I drain off the alcohol and mix that with 1 part alcohol, 9 parts distilled water, and that makes a very nice, inexpensive skin toner. It can also be used medicinally, but I use that one primarily cosmetically. Things like fast-growing plants like willow, for example, can be good for coppicing. And then if you grow grapevines like I do, you know that there's a lot of growth that gets cut off every winter or very early spring. And that can be excellent for turning into wreaths and various things of that kind. Other plants such as hydrangeas and even the Alchemilla mollis, the dried flowers make really nice decorative pieces. And your coppiced wood can also be used for whittling if you're into that kind of crafting. Now let's start with some examples of different kinds of tree gilds, and we'll start with the little leaf linden tree. Now I always have to tell this story because I think it's rather amusing, but we have a neighbor a few doors down, and many years ago they planted a little leaf linden. And after about 5 or 6 years, they came to see me in some dismay because they said, it's not little, it's not a little tree. And a little leaf linden is not a little tree. A little leaf linden has little leaves, but the tree itself is full-sized. Usually produces a rather lovely sort of mushroom shape, very even crown, and moderately dense shade. But this is a fabulous tree for the foundation of a bee guild, because those flowers in spring absolutely draw the pollinators in. When this tree is in bloom in the spring, it smells heavenly, and the pollinators just absolutely love it. Now, in each of the diagrams that I'm going to show you of tree guilds, including this one, north is at the top, and each of these fits into roughly a 10-meter space. So an ordinary front yard, 10 meters, about 30 feet across in any given direction. Our typical standard lot is about 50 by 100. So there should be room for one tree guild in either your front yard or your backyard, or possibly one in each, depending on the size of your home. And as you can see here, on the north side of our tree guild, we've planted a perennial herb, lovage, which is a really nice, useful plant. And remember what I said, it's a member of the Apiaceae or carrot family. So the lovage flowers are magnets for those beneficial parasitic wasps that I talked about. Rosa pomifera and Rosa rugosa are some of the perennials that we've got around here. We think of those as being ornamental plants, of course, but roses are edible, and rose hips are a very nutritious source of vitamin C. We've got some herbs on the south side here as well, and on the west side of our guild, mint, garlic, chives, both of which are perennials, and then dill, parsley, and caraway, which are more the annuals, with some echinacea, which of course is a perennial. And then over on the east side, we've got spring bulbs and turtle heads. So we can again focus on native plants that are going to bring in the pollinators at every time of the year, turtle heads being our fall flowering plant that will keep our pollinators happy. Now, what about if you've already got an evergreen in your garden? And this is one of the more common things that I hear from people asking Master Gardeners questions is, what can I grow underneath this big old pine tree in my front yard? Well, here's some ideas. You can, in fact, use that big old pine tree as the basis for a plant guild. And some of the things that will grow under it, you've noticed here on the north side, not very much, but on the south side, we've got some lingonberries. I have to say, not the tastiest of berries. They're a very, very hardy sort of subarctic plant that will grow just about anywhere. But you might consider haskaps as well. You need 3 haskap varietals for good pollination, but they're pretty small plants. So you could easily fit 3 of them just outside of the drip line on the south side of your pine tree or fir tree, where they're going to get some sun. Again, keeping in mind other structures. So if your tree is on the north side of your house, the south side of your tree is going to be in shade much of the day as well. So this may not work particularly well. Sweet Cicely will actually grow in the shade even of a pine tree. In this instance, we've got it on the southwest side. So we're making the most of what light will filter in through those fir tree or pine tree branches, which of course are evergreen. But Sweet Cicely is a nice little brown cover plant, and it is edible. It produces a little seed pod that tastes a bit like caraway. Daffodils will provide some pollination services for you. And we can think about putting a hardy geranium or lamium, both of which produce flowers and will provide some pollinator value as well. The hardy geranium being one that's more commonly a native plant than the lamium. And that can be planted up here in the northwest quadrant. And perhaps you could try it on the east side as well of your pine tree. So those are some ideas of things that you could plant as an evergreen guild. And now we're going to talk about, which one is this? Oh yes, this is our serviceberry guild. And serviceberries are relatively small trees. So if you have the space, there's actually room around your serviceberry to plant other kind of fruit trees. So for example, we might consider having some dwarf fruit trees around there, or perhaps gooseberry or currant bushes. And I just want to say a few words about the serviceberry. It is a native tree. It is one that I consider has 4-season interest. You get lovely white flowers in the spring. You get delicious big blue fruit in the middle of the summer, usually right around summer solstice. And I say you'll get them if you can get to them before the birds get to them and before the squirrels get to them. There's a lot of competition for those berries because they are quite delicious. In the fall, you'll have beautiful foliage, kind of a flame colored foliage if you get good sun on this. And in the winter, it's got lovely smooth bark and quite a pleasing shape. So very much a tree with 4-season interest. The only downside to the Amelanche or serviceberry tree is that it is a co-host to a rust, and that can cause some problems with the berries. The juniper is the other host to this rust. Now, my neighbor actually has a juniper right next door to me, and I've only seen the rust on the berries very occasionally. So it doesn't seem to be a massive problem, but it is something to be aware of. Now, on the north side of our serviceberry, we've got some horseradish, a nice perennial member, again of the carrot family, I believe. So this is one that where the flowers can be useful in bringing in those pollinators. We've got some lemon balm, which is a nice perennial herb. Some of you know that it can be a tad rambunctious, so something you want to keep in check. They're showing hazels here, as I mentioned. Hazelnuts do require at least one buddy for pollination, so presumably that's the other buddy there. Borage and strawberries on the south side of our tree, and we've got our dwarf fruit trees there as well. But I mentioned my serviceberry is not a big tree. It's actually become a very popular street tree in Ottawa. If you walk down Preston Street, starting at Carling Avenue, pretty much every second tree you see will be a serviceberry because the city has planted a whole lot of them, which is really rather nice to see. And this is my serviceberry guild. So I'm just going to walk you through what you're seeing here. And this is an example of how the things that we put in our garden are not always quite going to follow that neat little diagram that we saw. Because when I planted my serviceberry tree, I planted it into a mature garden. So I do have some of the things that that guild talks about. For example, there's an elderberry here. I have to say the elderberry wasn't getting enough moisture and it didn't survive. What else have I got here? Well, this is Tradescantia, which I mentioned is an edible. I've got some hosta here. The north side of my serviceberry, by the way, is the street. And so there's a little bit of stuff planted on the hell strip, mostly Canadian anemone and mint, which I've got contained in a big planting bag so it doesn't get too rambunctious. This pink tulip is growing out of a clump of the native bloody cranesbill, native geranium. I've got some purple alliums over here, cedar, and then this unruly looking green thing beyond the cedar is my Nanking cherry. And up here we've got the infamous Virginia creeper, providing mulch and other services for everybody else. So my serviceberry guild is not quite according to plan, but it does work. The little tree has done very well for itself. I'm able to grow irises and ornamentals and other edibles around it, even though the elderberry didn't survive. The Tradescantia, the hosta, the cedar, and the Nanking cherry are all doing very well. And worst comes to worst, I could always dig up my tulip bulbs and eat them too. Of course, we don't want to do that unless we absolutely have to. So that's an example of how things don't always go to plan, but they do still work. And now we come to our final guild. This is the walnut guild. And this is an example of an allelopathic tree and typically quite a large tree. So there are obviously limits to what you can plant under a walnut. Definitely not tomatoes. They just don't get along at all. But there are lots of other things that do. So for example, on our north side here, we're seeing spring bulbs and mint. We're seeing some comfrey, which as we saw was an excellent mulch plant. Down here on the south side, we've got other fruit trees, a little cherry tree perhaps, or a mulberry tree, perhaps some gooseberry or currant bushes, things that will do very, very well underneath our walnut tree. And you can go online and find lists and lists of plants that will or will not grow underneath a walnut. So you don't need to feel like having a walnut tree on your property is a limitation. It is, in fact, a gift that is definitely worth keeping. Beautiful trees, even though they do have that annoying allelopathy. So let's talk about how we put all those different pieces together. First of all, when we place our garden elements in the right position, what we're doing is creating synergy with it among those different pieces. As you saw going through the ecosystem functions when we talked about different plants, it is entirely possible, in fact, it's desirable to choose plants that will play as many roles as possible and that will be able to support the other players in our ecosystem as much as possible. Now, we tend to think of zones in terms of our hardiness zones, but when we talk about permaculture, the zones are also a term that we use to apply for convenience. And the importance of this is recognizing that none of us want to spend more time working in the garden than we need to. So what we want to do is we want to place those elements of the garden that require the most maintenance closest to where we're going to spend time. So zone 1 and zone 2 is where you'd put those things like annual plants or perhaps the lilies, things that need a lot of attention or things that need water because your source of water is close to the house. And zones 3, 4, and 5, moving away from your home, are places where you would put things that require less maintenance and less work. So here is an example where zone 1 is our house, everyday living areas, things like eggs and crops that are going to be harvested for dinner. Zone 2, things that we might use every second day or so. So for example, berries that we might harvest, every second or third day. Zone 3, we're requiring less and less attention as we move away from the house. And in zone 5, we have things that we only need to access perhaps once a month because it's a woodlot or an area that requires very little attention. So this is taken from my kitchen window. And I'd like to show you how I've used the zones in my small garden to minimize the amount of work that I need to do. So first off, standing at the kitchen window, what you can't see in this picture is that right underneath that kitchen window is my garden hose. And what I'm looking at here is what I call my beauty bed. All of my oriental lilies, my peonies, my irises, those really pretty plants. But lilies, as we know, can require a little extra attention. And by planting them right in front of my kitchen window, I can keep an eye on things and make sure that they are not wilting, that they are getting the attention they need before I even step out of the house. Also right underneath the kitchen window and sort of out of the frame of this picture, it would be down here at the bottom somewhere, is a little herb bed. So if I'm cooking dinner, well, actually, it's usually my darling husband who cooks dinner. He doesn't let me in the kitchen very often. But if I'm helping him, I can nip outside and pick some mint or some parsley or some lemon balm, something that we'll need for dinner that night. And it's literally right at my fingertips. As we move away from the house, this big old shrub here is one of my famous hazelnuts. I can keep an eye on that too, but shouting at the squirrels as they come and harvest the hazelnuts before I get a chance to doesn't seem to do a whole lot of good. There are also some raspberry canes along this fence that I might harvest from. And in this tiny little garden, this might be zone 2 or 3 here. So this is a space that I would use during the season, perhaps every day or every second day. But the raspberry season is only for a few weeks in July or August anyway. Behind my beauty bed is the pond and the waterfall, so I can keep an eye on the level of water in the pond. And perhaps once a week or so, I use the rain barrel, which is situated out of the frame on the deck of the back porch here, to fill up the pond if it's starting to run low. And believe it or not, behind these tall plants, which are Joe Pye weed, is my compost bin. See how nicely camouflaged that is? So that's way back there in zone 5 or 4 of my little garden. And I only need to go and empty the compost into it maybe once every 3 or 4 days. So it's well positioned and it's well away from the house. If it ever does smell, I'm not going to be able to smell it from the house. And usually I maintain it so it doesn't smell anyway. So that's an example of how I've organized my garden to minimize the amount of work by putting the things that need the most attention, like my beauty bed, right up close. And of course, that way I also have the enjoyment of it by being able to look at it out my kitchen window whenever I'm doing the dishes or whatever. And that concludes my presentation. So at this point, I would be very happy to answer any other questions that you may have.
Thank you very much, Rebecca, for coming and sharing all your ideas about permaculture and plants. And I'm sure most of, but I had some ideas. And I think it gives some ideas for people to think about. So hopefully we'll have some people out in their gardens and doing more permaculture and seeing it, just trying it out. So thank you very much for sharing your expertise and your interest. And I think everybody enjoyed it. I see lots of smiles.